There's a certain kind of silence that follows legends, the kind that settles after decades of music, love, loss, and unsaid words. For Eric Clapton, now at 80, that silence has become deafening. For years, he avoided the one topic that seemed to haunt him more than anything else: his relationship with George Harrison. The two men weren't just rock icons. They were bound by something far deeper, a friendship that blurred the lines between loyalty and heartbreak. But as Clapton reached this twilight stage of life, he's finally decided to speak about it. To tell the truth about George, about what really happened behind the music, and about the guilt that has followed him for half a century. Their story began in the late 1960s, a time when rock and roll felt like religion, and the Beatles stood at the center of the universe. George Harrison, often called the Quiet Beatle, was on a journey of spiritual discovery. Eric Clapton, already a guitar god in his own right, had just stepped into the spotlight after leaving Cream. The two crossed paths through mutual admiration, and an instant connection formed, not one of competition, but of respect. They understood each other in ways few could. To the world, they were untouchable icons, but behind closed doors, they were just two men trying to make sense of fame, love, and loneliness. But what started as a friendship soon took a turn neither of them could have predicted. At the heart of it all was a woman, Pattie Boyd, George's wife and Clapton's muse. Clapton fell hopelessly in love with her, even while she was married to his closest friend. He poured that forbidden love into music. Songs like Layla and Wonderful Tonight became haunting confessions of a man torn between devotion and betrayal. To the outside world, they were masterpieces. To those who knew the truth, they were emotional bloodletting. Years later, Clapton would say that writing those songs was the only way he could survive the pain of wanting something, or someone, he could never have. When Clapton finally confessed his feelings to George, what happened next stunned everyone. Instead of anger, George responded with an almost divine calm. There was hurt, yes, but there was also understanding. It was as if Harrison, already immersed in spiritual philosophies and inner peace, saw something tragic in his friend's pain. That moment, Clapton now says, defined their friendship forever. It was no longer just about music or fame. It became about forgiveness. And though Pattie eventually left George to be with Eric, the friendship between the two men somehow endured. That's the part the world never fully understood. How two men could love the same woman and still remain brothers. But as Clapton now looks back, his voice carries a weight that's hard to ignore. He admits there were moments of deep regret, nights he wished he had made different choices, times he wished he'd valued friendship over passion. George's passing in 2001 reopened all those wounds. Clapton was by his bedside near the end, holding his hand, whispering words that only they would ever understand. In his own quiet way, George forgave him again. Not just for Pattie, but for everything that had ever come between them. And for Clapton, that forgiveness became the hardest truth to live with. Now, decades later, as Eric Clapton opens up about those memories, it's not just a confession. It's a kind of farewell to a time, a friendship, and a love triangle that shaped two of the greatest musicians who ever lived. But what exactly did Clapton reveal about those final moments with George? What truth has he carried all these years, the one he's only now ready to speak aloud? When Eric Clapton speaks about George Harrison's final days, there's a tremor in his voice that no melody can mask. Time may have dulled the sound of screaming fans and roaring guitars, but it hasn't erased the echoes of that friendship. In his late interviews, Clapton confessed that watching George fade away felt like losing a part of himself. Theirs was not an ordinary friendship. It had survived betrayal, fame, addiction, and heartbreak. But as George's health declined in the late 1990s, Clapton realized something he had long avoided, that he had never truly said goodbye to his friend, not the way he should have. And so, when the news came that George's cancer had returned, Eric knew he had to see him one last time. When Clapton visited George in Switzerland, where he was quietly receiving treatment, he was struck not by how frail Harrison looked, but by the peace that surrounded him. George, ever the spiritual soul, greeted him with the same gentle smile he always had. like no time had passed, like nothing had ever come between them. There were no accusations, no awkward pauses, just two old friends talking about music, about life, about God. Clapton later said it was one of the most profound moments of his life. He was ready to go, Eric recalled, and he was trying to make sure I was ready too. That conversation, Clapton admits, changed him. For years he had carried guilt like a shadow, but George's calm acceptance felt like a release he never thought he'd earn. It was during that visit that Clapton noticed something extraordinary. George didn't talk about the Beatles or fame or the endless headlines that had followed them both. Instead, he talked about love, the kind that outlives regret. "We're all just passing through," George told him softly. "What matters is how much love we give while we're here." Those words stayed with Clapton like a melody he could never forget. For a man who had spent decades writing about loss and longing, it was a revelation. George wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry about the past. He was at peace. And somehow in that peace, Eric found forgiveness not just from George, but from himself. When George passed away on November 29, 2001, Clapton was devastated. The world mourned the loss of the quiet Beatle. But for Eric, it was deeply personal. He didn't just lose a friend, he lost the one person who had truly understood him. Yet, amid the grief, Clapton was given an unexpected task, organizing the memorial concert in George's honor. It was both an unbearable burden and a sacred gift. The event, Concert for George, held at the Royal Albert Hall in 2002, brought together musicians from every era of Harrison's life: Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Tom Petty, and of course Eric himself. But behind the applause and the music, there was a quiet ache in Clapton's eyes. Every chord, every lyric, was his final tribute to a friend he could never replace. The performance of "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" that night was something else entirely. Clapton stood center stage, playing George's song as if channeling every emotion he had never spoken aloud. His guitar cried with him, note by note. It wasn't just a performance. It was a confession. Those who were there said you could feel the presence of George in the room, like the two of them were having one last conversation through the music. When the final note faded, Clapton didn't smile. He simply looked down, nodded once, and stepped away from the microphone. It was his goodbye. In later years, Clapton admitted that he had spent a lifetime chasing peace through music, love, and faith, but it was George Harrison who had found it first. "He was the only truly spiritual person I ever met," Clapton said in one interview. "I envied that." And even now, decades later, he carries that sense of awe. For Eric, George wasn't just a bandmate of the Beatles or a fellow guitarist. He was a mirror, showing him both the beauty and the fragility of life. But Clapton's truth didn't end with George's passing. In the years that followed, he found himself haunted by memories, dreams, and even melodies that reminded him of his old friend. There were things left unsaid, secrets about their friendship and about the love they both shared for Pattie, that Clapton had never fully revealed. Now, at 80, he's finally ready to open up about those secrets, the ones that could change everything we thought we knew about his relationship with George Harrison. After George's passing, Eric Clapton found himself standing at the crossroads of memory and guilt. The world celebrated him as one of the greatest guitarists alive. But behind the applause, there was a man quietly confronting the ghosts of his past. He had played for presidents and kings, sold out stadiums, and inspired generations, yet none of that compared to the ache he felt when he thought of George. There were nights, Clapton admitted, when he would pick up his guitar and start playing without realizing it was always George's melodies that came through. The truth, he now says, is that George never really left him. "I still talk to him," Clapton confessed in one rare interview. Not in words, but in the silence between songs. And it's in that silence where the most haunting truths about their friendship began to surface. One of those truths revolved around Pattie Boyd, the woman whose love story with both men became one of the most talked-about tales in rock history. For decades, people saw it as a love triangle fueled by fame and heartbreak. But according to Clapton, the reality was far more complex and far more human. "I didn't steal Pattie," he once said quietly. She wasn't something to steal. Pattie, who had been married to George since the mid-60s, found herself torn between two souls who loved her deeply but differently. George's love was spiritual and distant. Eric's was desperate and consuming. She once described them as two men searching for the same kind of salvation in different ways. When George eventually stepped back and let Pattie go, Clapton thought he had won. But the victory was bittersweet. The marriage between Eric and Pattie didn't last, weighed down by addiction, fame, and the lingering shadows of the past. Clapton often said that no matter how much he loved Pattie, he could never escape the feeling that she belonged to another time, to another man. And that realization, he now admits, became one of the deepest regrets of his life. George, on the other hand, never expressed resentment. In fact, when he attended Eric and Pattie's wedding reception in 1979, he greeted them with warmth, even jokingly referring to them as Mr. and Mrs. Clapton. That was George, graceful, forgiving, and somehow above the pain that would have destroyed most friendships. As Clapton reflects at 80, he realizes that George's ability to forgive came from a place he himself had never reached. He was light years ahead of me spiritually, Clapton says. I was caught in my own ego, my own mistakes. George had already moved beyond that. That realization changed the way Clapton viewed their entire history. It wasn't about betrayal or competition anymore. It was about growth, about learning how to love without possession, how to forgive without forgetting. Clapton began to see that George had been teaching him all along, not through lectures or judgment, but through quiet example. There's a moment Clapton often recalls with tears in his eyes, a moment few people knew about until he finally spoke of it. Not long before George died, he visited Eric at his home. They spent the evening reminiscing, laughing like they used to, and before leaving, George handed him a small box. Inside was a guitar pick with the words, "Love one another," engraved on it. It was simple, almost childlike, but it said everything George had ever believed in. Eric kept that pick for years, tucked inside one of his guitars, as a reminder of the man who taught him what love truly meant. That's who George was, he says softly. He didn't talk about love, he lived it. And yet, as time went on, Clapton struggled with one final truth, something that took him decades to admit. In the years after George's death, he realized he hadn't just loved Pattie or envied the Beatles' fame. He had loved George himself in a way few could understand. He was my brother, Clapton said. Maybe the only real brother I ever had. It wasn't about rivalry or romance anymore. It was about a deep, almost spiritual connection between two souls who understood each other's pain, who spoke through music when words failed them. Now, in his twilight years, Clapton has started to see their story not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. A lesson in love, loss, and the kind of forgiveness that can only come from the heart. But there's still one more chapter left, the one Clapton has only recently begun to talk about. The night he claims he felt George's presence one last time, years after his death, during a performance that left even him shaken. It was years after George Harrison's passing when Eric Clapton experienced something that, to this day, he struggles to fully explain. It happened one quiet evening during a concert in London. The show was nearly over, and as Clapton prepared to play the final song, one of George's favorites, a strange calm came over him. The audience had no idea what was unfolding, but Clapton felt a presence he couldn't ignore. It was like he was there, Eric would later whisper. I could feel him beside me. He began to play, his fingers trembling slightly on the strings, and as the melody filled the air, the sound seemed to shimmer with something unearthly, something more than just music. For a man who had spent his life on stage, this was different. It was personal, almost sacred. Clapton said it was during that song, Here Comes the Sun, that he felt George's spirit most vividly. It wasn't a ghost story nor a fantasy, born from grief. It was as if George's warmth, his laughter, and his peace had returned just for that moment. The lights felt softer, the air still, and the sound of the guitar carried a gentleness that even Clapton couldn't replicate again afterward. "I didn't play that night," he said later. "Something else played through me." It was as if all the years of friendship, pain, and forgiveness had folded into that one performance. When the final note faded, Clapton closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, mate." No one in the crowd heard it, but for Eric, it was the farewell he had been trying to give for over 20 years. After that night, Clapton began speaking, more openly about George, not as a rock legend, but as a human being who had changed him. He started to share stories the world had never heard, how George would visit him unannounced just to check in, how they'd sit in silence for hours, saying nothing yet, understanding everything. "He had this way," Clapton said, "of making you feel seen, even when you didn't deserve it. And for a man like Eric, who had known addiction, heartbreak, and loss, that kind of friendship was a lifeline." It became clear that George's influence on him had never ended. Even at 80, Clapton still measures his choices against the quiet wisdom of his old friend. In recent years, when asked what he misses most about George, Clapton doesn't talk about the music or the fame. He talks about laughter. "He had the best laugh," Eric said softly in an interview. "It could break through any darkness." That's what he remembers now, not the complications, not the heartbreak, but the laughter. It's what keeps George alive in his memory. And perhaps that's what he means when he says he still feels him. Not as a ghost, but as a presence, woven into every note he plays, every song he writes, every moment of silence that follows. When Eric Clapton finally tells the truth about George Harrison, it's not a scandal, not a revelation meant to shock the world. It's something far more profound, a confession of love, respect, and enduring gratitude. He admits that George taught him what no fame or fortune ever could, the power of forgiveness and the peace that comes from letting go. "If there's one thing I learned from George," Clapton says now, "it's that love doesn't die. It just changes form." Those words carry the weight of a lifetime, of friendship tested by time, fame, and heartbreak, and yet still unbroken. As he turns 80, Clapton has come to see their story as something eternal. The world may remember him as one of the greatest guitarists to ever live, but Eric himself knows that his truest legacy is intertwined with George's. The two men walked parallel paths, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always connected by an invisible thread of music, love, and understanding. And now, as Clapton faces his twilight years, he no longer runs from the past. He embraces it. "George is still with me," he says. "Every time I pick up a guitar, I can hear him. Somewhere in the strings, somewhere in the silence." For Eric Clapton, the truth about George Harrison isn't just a story about two musicians. It's a story about humanity, about how forgiveness can outlast anger, how friendship can outlive pain, and how love, in its purest form, never truly ends. And maybe that's why, even now, as the lights dim and the crowd fades into the dark, the sound of that final chord lingers a little longer, because somewhere, somehow, George is still listening.